book of Exodus, chapter 8, and we're going to read just two pithy verses, 9 and 10. The book of Exodus, chapter 8, verses 9 and 10. I'm going to be reading from the NIV version, and when you found it, say, total life.
Total life.
Then you will find these words recorded. Moses said to Pharaoh, I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile. Tomorrow, Pharaoh said. Moses replied, it will be as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will leave you and your houses, your officials, and your people, and they will remain only in the Nile. I want to focus on verse 10. Pharaoh says, tomorrow. Pharaoh says, tomorrow. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer, shall we? Lord, we thank you and we praise you for another opportunity to teach your word, to dig into the coffers of your word, to help it make sense for our lives, to motivate us, to encourage us, so that we might become our best selves and leverage the life you've given us here on earth. Now, God, open our eyes that we might see, our ears that we might hear, and soften the soil of our hearts, that you might deposit seeds that will sprout up into a great harvest of a bountiful and total life. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen. Amen. You may take your seats in the presence of the Lord. We're not going to be before you long this morning. And we're just doing a very simple teaching, this morning, just entitled One Word. I just want to talk to you. If you are procrastinating, you're in the right place at the right time. Despite the rain, you're here. God has it for you to be here to hear this teaching. And I just want to talk to you about one word from the subject, tomorrow. I just want to talk to you from the subject this morning. Tomorrow. Just look at your neighbor and tell them, tomorrow. Tomorrow. I got my first introduction to the joys of fear when I was barely an adolescent. The year was 1980, and for my birthday, which might have been about 12 or so, my big sister took me to see my very first Broadway play. It was my first time seeing a Broadway play. And the play that she took me to was a play that was hot and very in vogue during that time, in the early 80s, called Annie. After the play, after the comic strip, Little Orphan Annie. You remember that play that was based upon the comic strip of Little Orphan Annie, whose unstable life went from rags to riches. Most of us remember that story. But aside from its alluring plot, I was equally regaled by many songs that the characters sung throughout the play. It's a musical. The music was great. And one of the songs which really captured my attention, aside from It's a Hard Knock Life, was the song Tomorrow. You remember the words to that song that everyone sang along with Orphan Annie, that words that said, the sun will come out tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar tomorrow there'll be sun. Just thinking about tomorrow clears away the cobwebs and the sorrows till there's none. And then when I'm stuck with a day that's gray and lonely, I just stick out my chin and grin and say, oh, tomorrow, tomorrow, I love you. You remember that. Tomorrow. It's always a day away. It was a happy happy song. It was an invigorating song. It was an encouraging song. Most people remember that. Even if you heard it once or twice in your life, you know that song. Most people resonated with this song because it gave the hopeful message that if today's not a good day, don't worry, because there's always tomorrow. But unfortunately, I think too many people are leaning a little too heavily, are you with me, on this concept of tomorrow as much more than a new start, but many people seem to lean on it a little too much as a sort of crutch. And so this text speaks to us today about the same view of tomorrow as not necessarily a new day, but more so as an excuse for our delays. During the initial stage of Israel's great exodus from Egypt, when God was sending a series of plagues to torment Pharaoh to coerce him to set his people free, you remember that scene. One of the most repugnant plagues that God hit Pharaoh with was this brigade of frogs. Not just a few, but millions of frogs. They were all over the place. They were in the streets. They were in homes. They were in the trees. They were in people's shirts. They were squished underneath people's feet. You name it, they were there. Millions of slippery, slimy, jumping frogs, enough to even make the most masculine of men to scream like a little schoolgirl. It was a disgusting scene. And so here Pharaoh found himself inundated, deluged with a barrage of frogs. And it was a lot for him. And the truth is that many of us have our own frogs that seem to keep plaguing us, that seem to keep jumping all around our lives. You know, frogs of negative habits and addictions, frogs of dysfunctional, toxic relationships, frogs of repeated failures and upsets, frogs of oppressive, unfulfilling jobs, frogs of unrealized dreams and aspirations, frogs of repeated bad choices and wrong decisions. And all of these frogs just seem to keep jumping around our lives. And they're so slippery and they're so slimy that we just can't seem to catch them. Ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. But back to Pharaoh, but feeling a bit sorry for Pharaoh and the Egyptians and them being inundated by all these frogs, Moses offers to stop the plague. And he says, I'll stop it. I'll stop the plague. If you've had enough, I'll stop it. But mysteriously, Pharaoh in verse 10 declines and says, no, do it tomorrow. In other words, Pharaoh was saying, well, let's wait for tomorrow. Are you kidding me? Tomorrow? You have millions of frogs jumping all over the place, and I'm going to relieve you today, but you say, put it off until tomorrow. Why would you put off, till tomorrow what can be handled today? And you know that, Miss Pharaoh, his wife Pharaoh, had to have a fit about this. Are you kidding me? The man was going to rescue us from these frogs, and you're telling him to do it tomorrow? And so the missus might have given him some pushback. But notice what Pharaoh was doing. He was using the idea of tomorrow as a tool of procrastination. You see, instead of dealing with the issue today, he pushed it off on the next day, which was tomorrow. Tomorrow became Pharaoh's crutch. It became his excuse. Tomorrow became his scapegoat for why he wasn't going to deal with the resolution of the problem today. In other words, tomorrow became Pharaoh's excuse to procrastinate on getting his problem solved. In short, tomorrow became Pharaoh's tool of procrastination. And you see, that brings us to point number one. For some of us, and so it is with us, for some of us, tomorrow is nothing more than a tool of procrastination. For some of us, tomorrow is nothing more than a tool of procrastination. In other words, we use tomorrow as a means to put off what we really should be doing today. We love tomorrow because tomorrow is our crutch. It is our excuse. It is our go-to day. It is the reason we're not doing what we need to do today. And so I can clean it up by saying, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. And please understand that tomorrow doesn't always necessarily refer to the next day, but it's really a reference to a later date. It's another word for some other day. It's another term for some other time. It's another terminology for some time in the future. So we say, tomorrow I'll deal with the frogs in my life. Tomorrow I'll deal with the complexities of my life. Tomorrow I'll quit smoking or drinking. I'll do it tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll get out of this crazy relationship that I have no business being in. Tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll go back to school. I'll fill out the application and I'll start the admissions process. Tomorrow I'll look for another job. I'm too tired today. I'll look tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll deal with this major issue in my life that has been gnawing away at my conscience. I'll do it tomorrow, not today. I'll get it. It's tomorrow. So we use the idea of tomorrow to delay our decision-making from today. And some of us have become board-certified experts at this. Yeah, we become board-certified experts at making excuses as to why we're putting off dealing with the frogs of our life until tomorrow. Oh, you'd be surprised as to some of the excuses we make for our procrastination. We'll say, well, the situation may change. The problem may go away on its own. It'll take care of itself. Or somebody may come up with a better solution. That's why I'm not doing it. Or I'll do it tomorrow because, I might win the Mega Million. I might win the Pick Six. Or, I'll do it because, it will take care of itself. Tomorrow's not promised. But we may say, well, not tomorrow because, tomorrow's not promised. Jesus may come back. And so there's no point in me doing it today because if he comes back tomorrow, then there's no point in me, putting my hand to the plow today. And the list of excuses as to why we're putting off stuff until tomorrow goes on and on and on. And before we know it, tomorrow turns into 5 days from now. And then 2 weeks from now. And then a month from now. And then 6 months from now. And then a year from now. Then 5 years from now. Then 10 years from now. It's interesting because Shakespeare's Macbeth put it just right. He said, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day until the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays are as light pulls the way to dusty death. Shakespeare understood that tomorrow is always coming and going and coming and going and it's creeping. And before we know it, tomorrow has morphed into several years and you're still dealing with the same old frogs. And the reality is some of us have been dealing with the same old frogs because we got tied up into tomorrow. You're still dealing with the same madness that has plagued your life for years because of your connection to tomorrow. You're still dealing with the negative habits, the drinking, the smoking, the overeating because you got stuck on tomorrow. You're still dealing with dysfunctional relationships that's draining you day after day after day because you got stuck on tomorrow. You're still dealing with the oppressive, depressing job that does nothing to fulfill your sense of fulfillment because you got stuck on tomorrow. Still dealing with the stagnancy of progress, the craziness that makes you want to holler because you got so caught up in tomorrow. Some of us are just tomorrow-holics. We're addicted. Abraham Lincoln said it best. He said, you cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today. And then we wonder why we're so miserable, we're just so unhappy, we're just so unfulfilled, we're just so ungratified. It really is interesting. Have you ever noticed that the 6 letters to the word, in the word satisfaction, make up the word action? Have you ever noticed that the last 6 letters in the word satisfaction make up the word action? Have you ever thought about that? In Latin, the prefix satis means enough. And then there's the suffix action, which means action. And what the ancient Romans clearly understood was that enough action produces satisfaction. Here's the word satisfaction. And one of the main reasons why some of us don't have any satisfaction is because we're not doing enough. Because our procrastination has left us knee-deep in stagnancy and inertia. And what's worse is that constantly procrastinating until tomorrow is an indirect way of putting our lives on hold. And when we put our lives on hold, we're not really living it. Look at your neighbor and tell them, put your life on hold. You're not really living it. And you see, the truth of the matter that because of our procrastination, some of us really, we haven't really lived for 10, 20, and 30 years. And can I suggest to somebody that the problem with always waiting for tomorrow is that tomorrow never comes. Because the moment that tomorrow is here, you're already on the next day of tomorrow. Can I suggest to you that to somebody that tomorrow never arrives, it never shows up, it never becomes the day, because it's always the next day, and before you know it, your whole life is over, and all you'll be able to talk about is what you wanted to do, what you planned to do, what you talked about doing, what you would have done, what I should have done, what I could have done. And that becomes our narrative, all because tomorrow became your crutch. So it's time to stop feeding the procrastination monster with a myriad of excuses as to why we're waiting until tomorrow. It's time to stop waiting for motivation or inspiration or perfection or clear direction or reassurance or someone to change or circumstances to change or the right person to come along or a new administration to take over or an absence of risk or the pain to stop or the rain to stop or sign an ultimatum from God. It's time to stop waiting, sitting on the beach of life, waiting for God to send you a message in a bottle telling you to go ahead and do it. Just go ahead and do it. Look at your neighbor and tell him, get on in with it already. And so Moses uses tomorrow as a tool of procrastination, but then it's interesting to explore the question of why. Why do we do this? Why do we lean on tomorrow so much? Why are we tomorrow-holics? Why do we procrastinate so much? Why do we put it off until tomorrow, the things that we could be doing today? The answer to this question is found in the reason behind why Pharaoh didn't let Moses stop the plague of the frogs. And there are two explanations, because really it just defies logic as to why Moses would put off until tomorrow something that was going to help him. And there are two reasons, one of which is implausible, which is not believable, and the other one is more of a plausible explanation. First, let me deal with the implausible explanation for why Moses was putting it off. First of all, is pride. Pride. See, in all honesty, some would argue that it was pride, that Pharaoh didn't want Moses to stop the frogs because he wanted to stop it himself. And if I let you stop it, then I look like I lost the context. And so my pride wouldn't. But the problem with this argument is that Pharaoh knew full well who he was dealing with. He knew he was dealing with God. And that based upon many other plagues that were sent, there's no way he could have won that battle. And so unless Pharaoh had delusions of grandeur, to say it was just pride, just simply is implausible. But here's a more plausible explanation for why he put it off till tomorrow. And that is one word, one small 4-letter monosyllabic word, and that is the word fear. Pharaoh was a maniacal despot used to having absolute power. He feared what his subjects would think of him if he gave in by allowing Moses to stop the plagues. He was afraid of what people would think, afraid of his reputation would be assaulted because he let God stop things. Not only that, but he feared what Egyptians would think of him. He feared the consequences of giving up. He feared what this could mean for Egypt. So fear is essentially what caused Pharaoh to put eliminating the frogs off till tomorrow. In short, fear was what caused his procrastination. And that brings us to point number 2, and it's simply this. Fear is often the reason for our procrastination. Now, maybe you never thought about that, but it's true. Fear is often the reason for our procrastination. Psychologists often define fear in the form of an acronym, and I want you to just take a screenshot of this acronym. Fear, the F stands for fantasize, E stands for experiences, A stands for appearing, and R stands for real. When we talk about fear, all fear is it is fantasized experiences appearing real. Fantasized experiences appealing real. You see, all fear is self-created by imagining some negative outcome in the future. The author and speaker Zig Ziglar put it best when he said this. He said, procrastination is paralysis by fear. Love that. If you don't get any other quote, get that. Procrastination is paralysis by fear. Procrastination is paralysis by fear. In other words, at the core of procrastination, of all of our procrastination, is fear. One of the most confusing animals to us as human beings is one that we often see lying on the side of the road. It is our friend, the deer. They confuse us because we can't figure out, if you're like me, you can't figure out for the life of you why these quick, spry, agile creatures, when crossing the road in front of cars, will suddenly stop in front of us and seemingly wait right there until we plow right into them. With all of that speed and all of that agility, has that ever been a conundrum to you? That why would such spry, agile creatures who have the ability to go from 1 to 60 in maybe 6 seconds, all of a sudden, just stop right in front of us and be frozen until we hit them? Why do they do this? One word: fear. The fear of this large object with shiny lights coming down them temporarily paralyzes them right in their tracks. In other words, they procrastinate moving because they get paralyzed by fear. And if someone were to try to push them, they wouldn't go because they're paralyzed by fear. And so it is with some of us. The reason why some of us won't move is because we're paralyzed by fear. Oh, is there anybody getting this morning? The reason why some of us won't move and we're constantly putting stuff off and off and off is because we're paralyzed by fear. We procrastinate because of fear. Fear that it won't work. Fear of rejection. Fear of failure. Fear of what might go wrong. Fear of what others might say. Fear of falling flat on our faces. Fear of being the laughing stock. Fear of failing at what we put our hands to. That's what it is. I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I leave this dysfunctional, abusive relationships today, I won't be able to find anybody else and I'll die a lonely old maid. I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I put my grown-up child out who won't work and pay his rent, he'll resent me and I'll lose the relationship. I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I go back to school to try to finish my degree, the work will be too hard. I won't be able to pass and I'll end up failing and then I won't get a degree and everybody will look at me. I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I venture out into this new career at my age, at 55 years old, it won't work and I'll end up working a minimum wage job until I retire and I'll be worse off than I originally was. I'm afraid. So leave me alone and stop trying to get me to change things because I'm afraid. Can't you see that I'm petrified? Can't you see that I'm terrified? Ever been there? Ever been frozen in your tracks because you were afraid, unable to move up in life because you were afraid, stuck in a toxic relationship because you were afraid, stuck in an unfulfilling job because you were afraid, stuck a prisoner in your own home because you were afraid, stuck living beneath your potential because you were afraid, stuck on the fast track to going absolutely unequivocally nowhere, all because you were afraid. And so we're just standing there going nowhere fast while everybody passing around us. But we can't move because I'm afraid. But hear me now. The problem is that if you stand still too long, that's your decision. Because we say, well, I'm just not going to make a decision. I'm not going to do anything. The problem is that if you stand there long enough, that's your decision. That if you do nothing about your drinking, to drink is your decision. If you do nothing about a dysfunctional relationship, to stay in it is your decision. If you do nothing about an unfulfilling, miserable job, to stay in it is your decision. If you do nothing about a wayward, incorrigible teen, to let him stay and do what he wants is your decision. If you do nothing about going back to school, then not going to school is your decision. In other words, to decide nothing is to do nothing. Look at your neighbor, tell him to decide nothing is to do nothing. Because you ain't going to do nothing until you decide. In other words, when we do nothing because we're paralyzed by fear, we end up letting circumstances decide our fate. So when we die, the epitaph on our tombstone will read like this: "Here lies John in his grave. Because he was too fearful, to himself he was no aid." And that's what will be on our tombstone in terms of wording. But so the question is, what do we do? What do you do when you're stuck in tomorrow mode? When you're stuck in procrastination mode and you understand that it's fear and it's fear by paralysis, how do you do that? What do you do when tomorrow is your secret crutch because you're paralyzed by fear? Have you ever had the experience of driving a car and because you felt some lag and drag, you realize that you left the emergency brake on? Well, notice what you didn't do. You didn't just push down hard on the gas to overcome the drag of the brake. That would be foolish. But instead, you simply released the brake. And with no extra effort, the car went much faster. Releasing the brake freed the car from its procrastination, its drag and lag. And that brings us to point number 3. Listen, the answer to procrastination is you've got to release the brakes. Look at your neighbor and tell him, release the brakes. Yeah, the answer to procrastination is you've got to release the brakes. See, whether we realize it or not, many of us drive through life with our psychological emergency brakes on. I mean, it's been on for years. In other words, we hold on to the negative images and beliefs about ourselves that we haven't yet released. And those negative images are our emergency brake. They're images of self-doubt. And we're holding on to images of low self-esteem. We're holding on to images of inferiority, images of negative family history, of past negative relationships. We're holding on to negative image of past failures and rejections, of past traumatic events. And these images serve as powerful forces that create their own comfort zone to which we become confined and shackled. And those images are us with that emergency brake on. So that every time we desire to step forward in life, we feel we can't because it's outside of our created comfort zone because that emergency brake is on. So we get caught up in the I would syndrome. You know the I would syndrome. I would go back to school, but that's out of my comfort zone because after all, I really don't have the time. I would try to go to rehab, but that's out of my comfort zone because after all, I don't want to make myself vulnerable to others. I would leave the toxic relationship, but that's out of my comfort zone because then I would have to find someone else and I'm not just up to starting with dating all over again. I would put my son out of the house, but that's out of my comfort zone because I don't feel like having to deal with him resenting me and dealing with the discomfort. So I just leave it alone. This emergency brake is there. And so the brakes of our lives have essentially kept us locked in these psychological prisons that cause us to procrastinate and never move forward to do the things in life that we know would be good for us to do. Are you with me this morning? A baby elephant, case in point, a baby elephant is trained at birth to be confined to a very small space. And what its trainer will do for the baby elephant is it will tie its leg with a very small, thin rope to a wooden post planted deep into the ground. And this confines the baby elephant to an area determined by the length of the rope, which becomes the elephant's comfort zone. Though the baby elephant will initially try to break the rope is too strong. And so the baby elephant learns that it can't break the rope because it's just a small little elephant. It's weak. It also learns that it has to stay in the area defined by the length of the rope. But here's the irony. The irony is that when the elephant finally grows up to be a 5-ton colossus of an animal that could easily break that same rope, it doesn't even try because for so long it's been conditioned as a baby to think that it can't break the rope. So the irony is that the world's largest land animal gets trapped in a comfort zone by the puniest little rope because it's been conditioned to think that it can't break the rope. And so it is with some of us. Some of us are still trapped in a comfort zone by some of the puniest little ropes that are made up of our negative beliefs and images that we've been nursing since we were children, not understanding that we're strong enough to break the ropes and release the brakes. Look at your neighbor and tell him, you're strong enough to break the ropes and release the brakes. But now see if you have an inquiring mind, because this is a thinking teaching. This is a thinking teaching. You'll say, well, how do I break the rope? How do I release the brakes? How do I do that? Well, release the brakes by doing two things. Here are the two things. Number one, here's the first step. You've got to cast down the negative images and beliefs that we have about ourselves. That's the first step to releasing the brakes. Cast down negative images and beliefs that we have about ourselves. You see, it's what the Apostle Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians 10:5 when he said, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. He was talking about casting down any negative images or beliefs that pop in our minds. Why? Because Paul understood that it's these very negative images and beliefs that make up the brakes that keep us confined so that we can't move. So in order to release the brakes, you've got to cast the negative thoughts and images down. Look at your neighbor and tell him, cast it down. Yeah, you got to start casting stuff down. So if my mind goes back to thoughts of self-doubt, I got to cast it down. So if my mind goes back to if my mind goes back to thoughts of inferiority, I got to cast it down. So if my mind goes back to thoughts of past failures and fiascos, you got to cast it down. So if your mind goes back to past abuse and misuse, you got to say, no, I'm not going to entertain that. I'm casting it down. So if your mind goes back to how you were rejected and abandoned as a child, you've got to say, I'm not going to even deal with that. You got to cast it down. So if your mind goes back to what my daddy said I would never be, what my mama left out of me, how the teachers mistreated me, how the world seems to reject me, every time your mind goes there, you got to cast it down and say, I'm not going to entertain that. I'm not going to give it life. I'm not going to give it air. Look at your neighbor and tell him, you got to cast it down. You cast down those negative thoughts and images, and as a result, that helps to release the brake. But watch this. Watch this. Here's the second step. After you cast it down, you got to take action. Look at your neighbor and tell him, take action. Yeah, you see, one of the biggest differences between winners and losers is that winners take action. They're action-oriented. They understand that in order to release the brakes and move forward, they have to take action. Listen, talk is cheap. Anybody can talk about what they're going to do, but it's only action. It's only doing something that releases the brakes. So you can talk about releasing the brakes all you want to, but the only way they'll be completely released is once you start releasing them. It's why the actor and writer Jonathan Winters said this. He says, if your ship doesn't come in, just go out and swim out to it. Look at your neighbor and tell him, if your ship doesn't come in, swim out to it. See, that's taking action. You see, I love the story. I love the story that is told of a man who goes to church one Sunday and he prays. He prays this prayer. This is a godless prayer, but this is what he prayed. He said, God, I need a break. I need to win the lottery. I'm counting on you, God. Having not won the lottery later that week, the man returns to church and gets down on his knees once again and prays to God. He says, God, about that lottery thing. I've been kind to my wife. I've given up drinking. I've been really good. Give me a break, God. Let me win the lottery just this once. And a week later, still no richer. The man comes back to the altar, prays again. Lord, I don't seem to be getting through to you about this lottery thing. I've been using positive self-talk, saying affirmations and visualizing money. I've been trying. I've been good this year. I've been trying to follow your word. Lord, just give me a break. Please let me win the lottery. And suddenly the heavens open up, white lights and heavenly music floods into the church. And a deep voice says, my son, why don't you give me a break? Buy a lottery ticket already. And so it is with us. Far too many of us are just waiting for stuff to happen. You got to go ahead and buy your lottery ticket, and I don't mean literally. But instead of waiting for stuff to happen, we have to take some action and make things happen. Hear me when I tell you that success is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. Look at your neighbor and tell them success is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. In other words, most of success is about action. Most of us are good planners. Yeah, we can plan the stuffing out of stuff. We can draft charts and timelines and graphs outlining what we're going to do, time frame, everything. We have all this stuff out there, and that's a good start. But planning alone won't release the brakes. Because it's not enough to just plan things. It's not enough to just plan to go back to school, but you got to start applying for admission. It's not enough to just plan to join an AA group, but you got to sign up and start going to the meetings. It's not enough to just plan to look for a job, but you got to start sending out your resume and following it with some phone calls. It's not enough to just plan leaving a toxic relationship, but you got to start packing your bags and start finding yourself a new apartment. It's not just enough to just plan putting a wayward grown-up child out, but you got to start giving him a deadline. The Nobel winning prize one Nobel winning prize author put it like this. He said, you can't cross a sea by merely staring into the water. Think about that. He said, you can't cross a sea by just merely staring into the water. And the truth of the matter is, for 10, 20, 30 years, some of us have just been staring at the water. Talking about crossing it, dreaming about crossing it, but all you've been doing is just staring. Most of us are familiar with the phrase ready, aim, fire. But the problem is that too many of us spend our whole lives aiming and never firing. We're always getting ready. We're always cocking back the barrel, but we never really fire. But hear me when I tell you this, that the quickest way to hit a target is to just fire. See where the bullet lands and adjust your aim accordingly. But the trick is you got to start firing. Stop talking about what you're going to do and just fire. Stop dreaming about what you like to do and just fire. Stop making excuses for why you're not doing what you should be doing and just fire. Stop bragging about what you could have done, but just fire. Stop crying about what you could have done and fire. Stop complaining about what other folk didn't do and just start firing. Here you are, 50, 60, 7 years old, and you're still talking about it when God is just saying you have everything you need. You have your health, you have your strength, you have your wisdom, you have support, you have me. Just fire. Look at your neighbor and tell him, just fire. Thank God Dr. King didn't just talk about a dream, but he fired. Thank God Barack Obama just didn't talk about becoming president, but he fired. Thank God Mother Teresa just didn't talk about helping the poor of Calcutta, India, but she fired. Thank God Nelson Mandela didn't just talk about ending apartheid, but he fired. Thank God Jesus didn't just talk about dying on the cross for the sins of the world, but one Friday evening he got up on the cross and fired. Listen, the world doesn't pay you for what you know. It only pays you for what you do. Look at your neighbor and tell them, the world doesn't pay you for what you know. It only pays you for what you do. Just fire. Because firing is taking action, and it's action that releases the brakes. I love the story of an old man who is affectionately referred to by his family as Grandpa Stewart. With a storied 40-year career in the Army, Grandpa Stewart had traveled all over the world. He was the premier military man. He had gone to Egypt and Africa and Antarctica, and South America and Australia. You name it, he had been there. And every time his family got together for their various holidays throughout the year, he would gather all 10 of his grandchildren together. And when they got together, he would entertain them with these wonderful tales of his travels, stories of love and war and hardship and struggle and heroism. And the kids would be totally rapt. They'd just be captivated by all of these fascinating stories Grandpa Stewart would tell about his travels. And he would always end his stories by saying, and you know, tomorrow, children, I'm going to write a book about that. And that's how he would end. And then this went on for years. Every holiday, after he regaled his children with these fascinating tales of his stories of world travels, he'd end by saying, and you know, tomorrow, children, I'm going to write a book about all of this stuff that I just told you. Until one morning, some 10 years later, his wife went into his room to wake him up, only to find that he had died in his sleep. And at his funeral, all 10 of his grandchildren were asked to share the one thing that they learned from Grandpa Stewart. And the youngest one, which at the time was 13 years old, she got up and said these words. She said, you know, Grandpa always wanted to write a book, but he always said that he would do it tomorrow instead of that day. And in the end, Grandpa never wrote the book. He died with the book still in him. She said, so what I learned from Grandpa is this: to never let tomorrow be the thief of today. And this is all I'm trying to say in this word, Total Life. Never let tomorrow be the thief of today. If you don't write anything else down, that's what you write. Never let tomorrow be the thief of today. You see, because tomorrow is just backup. It's just a stand-in. It's just for do-overs. Tomorrow is there just in case you couldn't get something done today. But tomorrow is never supposed to be instead of today. Never let tomorrow be the thief of today, to steal all that could be done today. Why? Because actually, tomorrow's not even promised. And all you and I really have is today. Think on these things. Let's pray. God, I thank you for this teaching. Someone came and needed that. I pray, God, that you would allow that word to marinate in their spirit, in their hearts, that someone would be motivated and encouraged to just take the bull by the horn and just fire and to jump into action. God, we realize that tomorrow's not promised to us, and all we really have is today. So I pray that you would empower each of us to not allow tomorrow to be our crutch, but that it would be about this day and getting all that we can done in this day. Seal this word in our hearts that we might be better stewards of the lives and of the time that you've given us to live here on this earth. In Jesus' name we thank you and we praise you. And we ask and pray these things in the precious and in the holy name of Jesus we do pray. And all of God's people said, amen. The doors of this church are open. Let's all stand. Maybe you're here this morning. You sat